declare the defense for opened, and I will give the floor to the external reader, Professor Tucker. Please.
Dear candidate, first of all, this was a joy to read, and I thank you for all the hard work that you put into this. So you note on page 237, and by the way, you alluded to this in your discussion that you weren't going to cover it, so now is going to be your opportunity to cover that, that commentators such as Anthony Thistleton and Hans Konzelman list 6 options as to which word is modified by the phrase, "in the name of the Lord." However, you note they do not even consider the approach you ultimately claim as your own. The immoral man commits incestuous acts in the name of the Lord Jesus, on page 238. You provide substantial arguments for the position, but why hasn't this position been considered by most as a viable option? And what do you perceive as the strongest grammatical and social identity theory argument for your position? Especially since those who call on the name of the Lord in 1 Corinthians 1:2 may rise to a superordinate social identity label for the Christ movement. My concern is, how did such a group belief develop? Is this a variant of the overrealized eschatology where the body doesn't really matter? Or an inference drawn from Paul's rule in all the congregations to remain in the situation they were when they were called, 1 Corinthians 7:20, which would include marriages if they're married to an unbeliever, 1 Corinthians 12:7, which you allude to on page 282. This cannot be a belief only that the immoral brother held, but one that others also in the group affirmed, as you highlighted, but for which Paul challenges the group in this regard to their misplaced honor claim in verse 2. They're boasting. So, rephrase the question. How do you come to the theological justification position, and what role did social identity approach play in your choice of this option, an option not considered by some, though not exclusively so, since you note that Wolfgang Strage does? And if you will, does your thesis rise or fall on accepting the theological justification position?
Thank you, esteemed opponent, for your question. Let me begin answering it by saying this was a surprising conclusion to me as well. It's certainly a careful undertaking to contravene many years of scholarship. And I would answer several questions that have been asked here, but the first one was why would this be a conclusion that I would make in distinction to other scholars who have thoroughly studied this text before? And I would answer that question by saying I believe that it has been removed prima facie from consideration just because the idea seems preposterous and unlikely, and that has created a bias against considering this as a legitimate option on the table in the same way that other options. In other words, we're looking for an explanation that is not this, because it even offends our notion of what it means to be a believer. You're reading the text and you're thinking either these people were very strange or idiotic or you think of a whole long list of uncomplimentary adjectives for people as a community that would say incest is something that is acceptable within our community. So this put me on a path to try to understand exactly what would explain the adoption of this by the entire community. I could understand one person deviating. I could understand the man. We've all met characters of various sorts, and many of us have been in pastoral ministry, so you realize that these things come along. But to have an entire congregation, it appears, I mean, it's not exactly here, it could be the preponderance of the congregation, but Paul confronts basically the church in whole in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. The preponderance of the congregation is actually endorsing this along with the man. And so, of course, the more recent proposals that have been put forth are that he was of such a high social status that the people felt like they were obligated to come along under him without questioning it. But the challenge for me was to say, I don't think that these solutions that have been put forth are something that we can sit on. And so that's where social identity came in to my answer of the question. For me, I looked at the cultural values of honor, shame, and shamelessness within the Roman context. And this is also counterintuitive to a typical Westerner, maybe not everyone in this room, but for a typical Westerner who don't live in an honor-shame context, understanding these categories takes a little bit of practice and revisioning in our reading of the text to think of it as Paul would read it. But once you begin to read 1 Corinthians in terms of honor and shame, you all of a sudden see things that you didn't realize were there before. Anyways, if I haven't answered your question, let me just conclude by saying this. One thing that I wanted to be true of my thesis was that I wanted it to be an excellent example of historical grammatical work in the text while also employing social identity theory and social scientific criticism as a means of elucidating the meaning of the text. So I always wanted the primacy to be on historical grammatical, with social identity coming along as a heuristic tool. And so this particular issue that you surfaced is an area where I attempted very hard to make that happen. In other words, the argument that I've made here is that the linguistic pattern that the Apostle Paul engages in is such that we almost have a grammatically probable reading that the man committed the incest in the name of the Lord Jesus, and so that we are actually moving against a proper and likely reading of the text by moving away from that. And you know, there was a lot that went into that in terms of listing numbers of words and showing patterns and so forth. The social identity piece came in by identifying the honor, shame, and shamelessness, and essentially communicating how the Apostle Paul is looking at this, how the Corinthians were looking at it.
Thank you. So as a follow-up, William S. Campbell, in his work, says that identity precedes theology, and that identity issues are what raise the theological patterns and concepts that we see, like in our scriptures, for example. And so if that is a probative, as a way to think about this, is in fact this theological justification actually a social identity justification?
On the part of the Corinthians, is their theological justification actually you categorize it as which? A social
identity concern, since identity precedes theology and gives rise to the theological constructs.
If I'm understanding your question, I would say yes to that. I would say that this is very much an identity question for them, that they are understanding themselves to need to be distinct from the world around them. So in this aspect, not in all aspects of their Roman identity, they certainly didn't abandon all of their Roman identity, but in this aspect, they felt that abandoning their Roman identity was a way in which they could distinguish themselves as different, and that they were embracing what they thought the Apostle Paul was teaching them was be different. But of course, they didn't factor in the Torah and the Old Testament standards appropriately, and I think that's why the Apostle Paul actually brings in so much Old Testament language into this text. You wonder, well, these are Gentiles. Why is he exhorting them with the Jewish canon? Well, I think the answer to that question is because they needed to understand the standards that they had forgot to factor in as they had been comprising their own identity.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tucker, for starting this nice conversation, and we'll continue the conversation. And I give the floor to Dr. Williams.
Dear candidate, dear David, let me congratulate you on getting your thesis to this point and for responding to all the questions that Professor Dr. Koch and I have asked you over these last number of years. I have yet another one for you. So, on page 64 of your thesis, you say that your thesis is an analysis of how the expulsion of an individual in the Corinthian context reveals Paul's assumptions related to the identity of the ecclesia in the Roman milieu. Then later, on page 65, you say this thesis seeks to explain the social realities which informed Paul's urgency and severity in response to the immoral man of 1 Corinthians 5, 1 through 13. It's those three words, urgency and severity, that I'd like you to explore in this question. How do your conclusions relate to other Corinthian scholars who view other problems as also being either severe or potentially urgent? For example, Margaret Mitchell will argue for the importance for the problem of division as being the most severe problem throughout the greater part of 1 Corinthians. Bruce Winter and Samuel Pogoloff will say that the most severe problem at Corinth is Greco-Roman sophistry and rhetoric, and find many parallels to sophistic texts. Adam White would argue that the most severe problem is Greco-Roman education that has infiltrated the Corinthian church, and so is willing to even threaten to bring a rod of discipline, which sounds pretty severe and also sounds somewhat urgent. And then some like Anthony Thistleton and B.J. Oropeza will see that the most severe problem in Corinth is an over-realized eschatology. So, can you place your thesis's conclusion that the man caught in incest is an urgent and severe problem in relationship to these other viewpoints?
Thank you, esteemed opponent, for your question, and thank you for your many questions along the way. They have improved the thesis immensely. When one is considering the meaning of a text, one has to be very careful not to find a lens that becomes a monochromal lens through which you see everything. I think this is the temptation of most exegetes. And so in trying to determine how the situation of the immoral man might be explained, I wanted to be very careful to avoid finding social identity under every rock in 1 Corinthians. And so, in answer to your question, I would say that there's a little bit of an apples and oranges comparison. If I could just take maybe Mitchell just as one example of this. I found Mitchell's work to be extremely helpful and valuable. But in Mitchell's case, she's addressing the issue of the unity of the correspondence by looking at the way division plays throughout the entire letter as opposed to just sort of spuriously segregating chapters 1 through 4. So she then uses that as a broader tool for argumentation related to the book. If that's a triangle that starts here and points down, I would argue I'm a triangle that starts here and points up, because I'm trying to deal with chapter 5 and say, how can we explain chapter 5? In order to do that, I have attempted to identify a bounded framework using social identity as a theory within 1 Corinthians, because I didn't want to just insert something into chapter 5 that wasn't true more generally of the Apostle Paul. But I'm not making an argument related to 1 Corinthians in this thesis that social identity becomes an explanation of the larger framework of Corinth in general. I'm not saying that argument can't be made or shouldn't be made. I'm just saying I'm not making that argument in particular. I'm trying to use Paul's patterns of bounded thinking as they can be established to explain why he responded as he did. Maybe the last thing that I would say in response to that would be that, let me just leave it at that.
Okay.
Have I answered your question?
Yes,
Okay.
that's fine. I'm just thinking in terms of, it's urgent to cast out the man and do so immediately, but Paul only takes, let's say, just working with the logic from Mitchell, Mitchell will say the entire letter is devoted to division. That seems to be severe, and yet it's only one chapter.
In terms of the severity and urgency, I would say it's the point of view that distinguishes what I'm doing from, say, the example of Mitchell. So I don't know what the Apostle Paul would say is the most important issue as he wrote this letter, but an author, and many of the authors you mentioned are saying, here's a lens through which we're seeing this book, and this is very, very important to the Apostle Paul. I don't negate that, but I would say in terms of his response is elevated. But that's a different question than saying, what did he feel was most important? So is unity more important than countering incest? I'm not going to venture to answer that question, but does incest cause a more severe and elevated, escalated response? I think that I would say yes from the text.
Yep. Yeah. Thank you. Do I have another minute? Okay. You had already alluded to the greater number of scripture quotations and allusions in 1 Corinthians 5 that are related to this ethical problem. Can you explain further how the wealth of Scripture in 1 Corinthians 5 helps to emphasize the urgent and severe problem that Paul sees with the man caught in incest?
Yes. Perhaps the most glaring example of this would be the final verse in chapter 5, verse 13, where it says, put out, I can get the exact quote here, but it's right from Deuteronomy. Actually, it's mentioned several times in Deuteronomy. I think chapter 13, 17, 21, 22, maybe even 24. I don't remember all off the top of my head.
Multiple.
But it's not just a reference, it's a quote. I mean, the Septuagint is pretty much identical, except for the imperatival form is used in the New Testament, whereas in the Septuagint, it's a second person singular, as I recall. But it's no question that the Apostle Paul is referring to this. And when you go to those contexts, each of them was a capital scenario. And so I think to answer your question about how Paul employs the Old Testament to make his point here, I didn't address this in the thesis, but just to answer that question, I would say that it's that quote, that appeal to the Old Testament, for the minds of a Jewish person hearing this, is definitively going to escalate this issue as one that could potentially be a capital offense. And of course, that's an open question interpretively as well, as to what Paul means here in terms of the person's life. But I think that the Apostle Paul utilizes the Old Testament to communicate the seriousness of this issue, as well as I said earlier, to communicate the standard by which the Corinthians ought to be adjudicating their behavior.
Okay, thank you very much.
And we continue the conversation with Dr. Otten. Please go ahead.
Dear candidate, allow me to congratulate you on a job well done. And your first draft was very clean, and the few loose threads that I was able to find, you cleaned up in the final draft, much to my annoyance. But one can always still find a few threads, so let's continue on the question of severity and urgency. You state several times, you did in your summary, that the main reason for this is witness. I'd like you, though, to discuss what you also very cleverly pointed out, that the stated purpose in that passage in verse 5 is the restoration of this man, his ultimate repentance and restoration into the community. And I ask, is that not a sufficiently urgent issue apart from any question of witness, which is not explicit in the passage, though you draw it from verse 1?
In other words, should we not prioritize the restoration of a brother and his salvation over and above the outbound focus that I've emphasized in the thesis?
Is that not the reason for Paul's urgency, what he stated explicitly? Yeah.
Thank you, esteemed opponent, for your question. I don't necessarily see those as bifurcated realities which must stand in competition to one another. Theologically, in the same sense that the cross serves as the most horrific reality in the history of humanity and the divine plan, and also stands as the greatest high point of our redemption, I think God fully well can subsume multiple purposes within his divine plan. And I think that we see the Apostle Paul expressing concern for both. So obviously he does express an explicit concern for the man's salvation. He states it there quite clearly. But part of what I wanted to do in my thesis was to highlight that which was implicit in the text. Now, of course, this has to be undertaken with great care, because you don't want to be inserting things that aren't there, and you don't want to be reading things into the text that aren't there. But nevertheless, every text has a context, and by that I don't mean what we typically mean in terms of literary context. By that I mean that certain things are said and not said based on the knowledge of the people in that environment. So, if we were having this ceremony here in the jungles of Papua New Guinea, in the middle of a village, we would have to explain to some people why some of us in very hot weather are wearing hot black robes and others are not. But no one needs to explain that here today because we understand full well what's going on, and that's related to the context. So what I've tried to do is to identify why the Apostle Paul may not have stated that which is implicit in the context, but to do so in a way that it's fully well justified so that it's not simply finding something clever or novel.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to another issue that you discussed in that chapter. In proposed explanations for Paul's response, here I'm looking at page 22, you rightly comment on spiritual contamination and the image of leaven. However, I wonder if you too quickly or easily conflate contamination with temptation to sin, which is the main topic of that particular paragraph in what you write. As you say, it's hardly likely that many other Corinthian Christians are now going to be tempted to go have incestuous relationships with their own stepmothers. But the Old Testament is full of examples in which a unique sin has a more abstract contaminating effect on the community, regardless of their potential temptation towards it or even their knowledge of it. Here, we might think of Achan, for example, who committed his sin in complete secrecy. And yet, the Lord said that all Israel is contaminated and under God's judgment.
If I'm allowed to do so in this context, I would partially grant that point, actually, that there needs to be a very careful delineation between contamination and temptation. In the final draft of my text, I did tighten that up to just basically say that I'm talking about temptation here, more so than even contamination. Paul does use the language of contamination, but I would argue that it's the conduit through which temptation comes, that were you not to have the contamination, then the possibility of temptation doesn't exist, and that is the reason why the Apostle Paul would have been concerned about the presence of the sin within the congregation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I did notice you tightening it up. I would encourage you potentially to tighten it up just a little bit more, because I do think it's a distinct topic that is at play at various points in Corinthians and might strengthen where you're going.
Well noted.
Okay. Let's talk about incest a little bit. You did extensive, very impressive work in that particular chapter dealing with the Roman background, Roman viewpoints on interest. I wondered at a few points, though, is this an example of the lady doth protest too much? That if we have so many people talking about incest and how bad it is, isn't that evidence that it is indeed happening and perhaps not quite the serious taboo that you're suggesting that it is?
Well, I don't think so, because just to use an analogy, if you were to take a 200-year period of United States newspaper publications, search for the word incest, I think that you would find more references than I found in the 1st century BC, 1st century AD, and literature from antiquity. I think we'd find an abundance of reference to that in the newspapers over a 200-year period. But that would not in any way cause me to draw the conclusion that incest is an everyday issue in the context that I live in the United States, or even historically what I know to be true. I think that when you accumulate this many in a chapter, it seems overwhelmingly to be something that was discussed, but these are 40 and 50 years apart in some cases. And so I think it leaves that impression. Incidentally, I will not claim that I've been exhaustive, because as soon as I do, someone will find something that I've missed, of course. But this is an attempt to be, this is everything I found, and I worked for a year at locating incest references in the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. So I would say that this may seem extensive, and it may potentially, possibly be exhaustive in terms of what we have. And you can imagine my dinner time conversations when I answer the question we all answer, what are you studying? The object in that case is to do something that's understandable and humble, right? And I didn't ever have to worry about that. I just said, I'm studying Roman views of incest, and the conversation went on from there.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Otten. Please take the chance to ask your question, Professor Van Buchem.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate, for me as an Old Testament scholar, I was really impressed, and it was a joy to read your study. The way you lay out also the Old Testament references, explicit and implicit, but also the way you tie together, on the one hand, linguistic and historical information, and on the other hand, social scientific categories such as shame, honor, shamelessness, ritual, and so on and so forth. As an outsider of New Testament studies, this brings me to the following question with regard to how to place your book in the larger field. So in a way, this is a home game. You know, we have Professor Koch, we have both other Americans who are really sympathetic to this approach. But of course, we all know that there are also skeptics in this regard. And because you intermingle this information in a really pleasant way, I was thinking, okay, suppose I was also such a skeptic. Could you, to me, explain in words not using social scientific categories, how your book can bridge the gap to those skeptics?
Thank you, esteemed opponent, for your question. Let me begin my answer by saying that I am the chief of all skeptics, actually. I was not sold on social identity theory when the idea was presented to me, and primarily because I had deep and abiding concerns about displacing the historical grammatical methodology as it related to the text. And so for me, I actually wrote large portions of my methodological chapter before I entered the dissertation phase for me, because when one writes a dissertation, one must be intellectually honest, and I needed to be able to proceed with a sense of guarantee in my own mind that it was possible to use social scientific categories while also retaining all of the strengths and methodologies of a historical grammatical approach. So in terms of answering the question for a skeptic, I would say, number one, one must be skeptical, and that sort of skepticism is welcomed and wise when it comes to the introduction of new methodologies. Secondarily, I would say one must put into place safeguards to avoid the imposition of meaning and anachronism in the text. And so one of the safeguards that I put into place, for instance, was simply to prioritize. I said straight up in my methodological chapter, there's a prioritization here, and this will come to play before this comes to play. I always wanted psychological principles to be descriptive and not prescriptive. That's where the danger comes in, is when you say, well, this is what social psychology tells us about what someone will do, therefore this is what this person did. And so methodologically, I'm trying to bridge that gap a little bit more softly and not so harshly, as has sometimes been done. And so these are two steps that I took to try to make sure that we have an example here of good exegesis, but exegesis that does not forego the opportunity to learn from that which is implicit in the text. And so I want the strengths of both areas of criticism. I want the strengths of social scientific criticism to be brought to bear, and I want the strengths of historical grammatical criticism to be brought to bear.
Okay, thank you. I think the case you've chosen is, in particular, of course, a specific, also, it's very, very characteristic where you can apply this. But you also, again, putting your work in a larger field. You work also in mission, and you've done work in church history. So did come some parallels in history or in mission or in present society come to your mind, of course, that might explain this sudden expel of this immoral man from the community, which might also bring help understanding how this exactly works, and that it might even serve the gospel.
Well, yes, this is the point that's very important to be made. If we don't understand Paul's motive for his response. We are really left with nothing other than to say something horrific happened in Corinth. And if you happen to run across a situation where you have incest in your church, maybe you could even narrow it by saying consensual incest, which was the case in this situation, then you can do this. But how in the world do you apply it in situations beyond that? And so I believe that this interpretive stance that I have taken in the thesis gives us the tools by which we can apply this in other historical contexts and across culture, because we now have an additional criteria. Everyone has generally agreed on the criteria that it must be a serious sin and that the person must be unrepentant in order for some sort of expulsive response to be appropriate. But I have added a third category in this analysis, and that is to say it must have a very serious impact publicly on the witness which the ecclesia has. And so this methodology now gives us more tools to be able to contextualize this in ways that we might not otherwise be able to do so unless we simply replicated the situation or guessed at what the Apostle Paul would do.
Okay, that's the hermeneutical framework, but did come to mind some concrete parallel during your studies, or not yet?
Well, I guess not. When you mean concrete parallel, are you talking about a
concrete situation in both in society and the church that you might say, okay, there is a strong parallel here to the situation Paul is describing?
Well, perhaps I'm not completely understanding the question. If I'm not, just stop me then. I would say in the American context, a parallel would be embezzlement of funds. Americans do not like this. We do not tolerate it. And so it has an extremely negative effect on public witness, and it also violates parties. And it's interesting, Paul uses the term greed in chapter 5 as well, so perhaps it rises to that level of seriousness. So that would be an example of a particular sin that I feel like we might be able to apply expulsive consequences to. Am I understanding your question, sir? Okay.
I was thinking of that. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor van Beckham. And we'll continue the conversation with Professor Barenson. Please go ahead.
Dear Mr. Kanda, dear David, I appreciate your courageous research. 1 Corinthians is, I think, one of the most heavily trafficked territories in New Testament studies, and it's quite daunting to venture into that field as a PhD student. I read your work with growing appreciation. I'd like to discuss the problem of divisions. As we all know, Paul deals extensively with divisions in the first 4 chapters. Then in chapter 5, he turns to a new issue. As you are aware, I argued in my dissertation from the very same spot that chapters 5 and 6 are still part of the division problem. The argument goes like this. The man who committed incest was one of the church's patrons. Believers who were part of a subgroup could not afford to confront him because they were bound to honor him. To make a bad situation worse, the subgroup begrudgingly decided that they might as well boast about the incest, since at least it made them distinctive within the house church network. So in my opinion, the incest case is part of the division problem, part of the bad fruits of the division problem. But if I understand you correctly, you would think that the division problem was over at the end of chapter 4. Chapter 5 does not relate to divisions, but to a moral problem. I'm not sure if I understood you correctly, but could you clarify your position on the divisions and interact with my proposal?
Thank you, esteemed opponent, for your question. I don't believe that I took a strong position on the connectivity between chapters 1 through 4 and chapters 5 through 7 in 1 Corinthians vis-a-vis the rhetorical flow of the narrative. I would argue that there are several lexical points of correspondence between chapter 4 and chapter 5 which would argue against a firm break between those two chapters, as is often noted in many commentaries. And as I mentioned earlier, I found Mitchell's work quite intriguing to me because I feel like she actually brought a sense of unity to the book and how the themes interplay with one another that is often not accomplished. And I appreciated that because I believe that the Apostle Paul was more integrated in his thinking than we sometimes perceive in the way we parcel out the book. I mean, in thinking back over emerging leadership, I would say that I would share your assumption. I mean, you developed the idea that, as I understood it, and as I'm recalling, that you have subgroups, and that the subgroups within the Corinthian context that contributed to the divisions were related to social realities, and that those social realities are the lens through which we need to understand these. And I actually agree with that, and I didn't address that in my thesis, but I used that as one small point in my chapter in developing the construct of boundedness, because I was saying, well, ironically, the fact that we have subgroups is indicative that there could be a superordinate identity, which you noted the Apostle Paul is aiming to help people to understand. So,
Okay. I'm glad to hear that we apparently agree more than I was wondering, or than I was aware. The connection makes a great deal of difference, because if my proposal works, then the Corinthians were not agreed, morally convinced of the permissibility of incest, but then they were forced to permit it by social obligation. And then what might have happened in the Corinthian church, with the rivalries going on, that other groups could not challenge the patron either, and they had to just get on with their business of being rivals, and they left the issue of incest undealt with, which is a different explanation for why incest might have been accepted within the entire community, not by moral conviction, but by social obligation.
yes.
And that would, in my opinion, tilt the evidence for the what my colleague Professor Tucker indicated, for the in the name of the Lord, to choose a different grammatical option, because the grammatical option is likely, but then social identity might tilt it in a particular direction.
Yes. Now I'm more thoroughly understanding your question. In some ways, the solution you've offered parallels Chow's solution in regard to patronage, and I guess I'm just trying to sort through social possibility, social probability, and what we can definitively know. Some people may want to take me to task on the work that I've done with honor and shame as to whether that falls into as strong a category as I would put it in. But I have banked my argument on the fact that honor and shame has such extensive cultural research done on this in relationship to the New Testament in that context, that I'm going to rely on Molina and Rohrbaugh and many, many others' scholarship to say this is something that we can know for sure. I can't say that Chow's solution or Clark's solution or your solution are definitively not an option or not a distinct possibility. I feel like I can say that the honor, shame, shamelessness solution is something that we can actually say is probable. And I understand that would be a subject of debate. I fully well realize that, and I'm ready to join on that, which is why I put the grammatical piece in there, because if you just take it on social grounds, then you're only one-sided in your interpretation. But I've tried to show how the grammatical interpretation would lean towards theological justification for the incest, and that then the social explanation needs to confirm that, as opposed to the opposite way around methodologically. So I guess we do have a little bit of a disagreement on that then.
Yeah, but I think with honor shame, we follow some of the same trajectory, and that's not a very clear thing, because sometimes Paul resists that, and sometimes Paul goes along with that. But let me take another step in the argument, and I'd like to actually propose a different explanation for Paul's severity. Why not? This is the last question probably, so here's the opportunity to field the question. When dealing with the divisions in 1 Corinthians 1 through 4, Paul needs to proceed very carefully, because many Corinthians are not loyal to Paul. They're loyal to another leader. So if Paul appears too authoritative, then his arguments would backfire and increase the divisions. So he needs to go very gently. And he does that 4 chapters long. Then he closes the argument. But he has a lot of issues to confront, so Paul really needs to address the congregation with authority. And so he picks on an issue on which you can expect quick agreement, and, well, that's incest, because everybody knows that's wrong. Paul can appeal authoritatively to this cultural taboo without danger of further dividing the church. It seems to me that Paul thus recovered his authoritative voice within the Corinthian church, and that his renewed apostolic authority empowered the Corinthians to confront the incestuous patron. I wonder if you might find this proposal convincing to complement or even offer an alternative to the thing, what you've worked so hard to define why Paul is so severe.
Well, if I rhetorically were going to determine what I thought my best shot at convincing someone would be, I personally would not start with the topic that everyone seemed to agree on. There's this irony in the text that the Apostle Paul talks about disunity and the way in which the church is disunified in chapters 1 through 4, and you get to chapter 5, and all of a sudden they're unified, but they're unified on the wrong matter. And so, I guess I mean, I have to think more about it, and this context is hard for me to think of anything at this juncture. But I think that to me, I would believe that the Apostle Paul would do exactly the opposite, that he would avoid an issue which he felt like everyone was unified on, not seeing that as the potential issue which he might bring unity in the opposite direction.
It's a very difficult interpretive move, of course. Your research showing the general taboo against incest actually makes me more convinced that this is one of the key issues where Paul can expect agreement, but then why did the Corinthians
But he
come to
knows
accept
it's
it?
not there.
Right.
So
But thank you for interacting with them.
thank you, esteemed opponent.
And thank you, Professor Barendse. Thank you. The candidates, I suggest to end the defense at this point. The defense is hereby concluded, and the doctoral faculty will now retire for its deliberations.